All right, another ecology slideshow here. This is mostly going to focus on the ecosystem ecology, which is biotic and abiotic factors. Um, but we're also going to be looking a lot at food webs here, and food webs typically fall into the community because it's talking about the living things and how they're eating each other. However, it's hard to talk about food webs without talking about nutrients and some of those other abiotic factors. So again, ecosystem is all of the living and non-living things in a given area. And this is one of my favorite models because it shows that energy flows, but chemicals cycle. So energy flows from the sun into living things, but we also send some energy back out through heat. And that energy flows through a process of consuming or eating through the heterotrophs. But what's essential to this, if this whole system is going to maintain any kind of stability, you have to cycle nutrients. Because no matter how much the sun shines on plants, if they don't have the nutrients to grow, you're not going to be able to have much of an ecosystem. So what you're going to see a lot over the course of this slideshow is the importance of microorganisms and detrivores to break things back down and put them in simple chemical forms to get back into plants. So, food webs. So we have this Chesapeake Bay waterbird food web. So using this diagram, map out a single food chain. Now again, the arrows are pointing from the thing that is consumed to the thing that is eating. So if we are going to map out a single food chain from producer to tertiary consumer, the producers are the plants, right? So we can start down here and we pick one of these. And a food web is just a whole bunch of interwoven food chains. So we could start down here, and from here we have this producer moving up to this benthic invertebrates, to the sea ducks, to the bald eagles. Now, again, we do have vegetation in water food webs, but it's not always just trees and plants. We have phytoplankton. We have tiny little photosynthetic microorganisms involved as well. So as we continue on, it says here, using the above diagram, give an example of interspecific competition and how the different species are affected. So this ties us actually back into our community ecology area here. But if we have sea ducks and tundra swans both eating bivalves, they're competing for the bivalves, they're both going to be harmed from that competition, as opposed to if there was only one thing eating the bivalves and they had all access to just themselves. Now, the next question is, can different species occupy the same niche? And again, niche is not just habitat and not just what it eats, it's the combination of its entire role in the ecosystem. So you can't have two things um, doing the exact same job. If sea ducks and tundra swans were both nesting in the exact same locations, eating the exact same things, one would outcompete the other, or they'd have to use resource partitioning. Now, the way this works, they're both eating bivalves and there's competition for bivalves, but the sea ducks are also eating benthic invertebrates. So we have some resource partitioning where they overlap in one respect, but they don't occupy the exact same niche. Now, again, coming back to detrivores, what role would they play in the above food web? Anything that dies, vegetation that dies, you have to have things that break down dead material and recycle the nutrients back um, into living things. So, a lot of times when we look at food webs, we talk about certain species that are important. And if they were gone, how would that affect the overall web. And one example here is we're going to talk about keystone species. A keystone species has a very unique and huge impact on an ecosystem. And in this way, beavers are a keystone species. So by damming a river and creating a big wetland, like a pond or a lake, they actually manufacture, they make the ecosystem. They make the entire thing work because if they weren't here, you would go back to a river. And because it is a dammed river where you have this large wetland in this lake, you have an entire ecosystem dependent upon the beaver and their creation of the wetland ecosystem. So we would consider them a keystone species. Sometimes keystone species are top predators or apex predators that keep everything in balance. And if you take them out, things would go all haywire. But keystones are essential, that it's like the keystone in an arch. If you take it out, the thing would fall apart. In addition to keystone species, we also talk about dominant species. And a dominant species is the one that's going to have the most biomass. So now that we're starting to get into these pyramids, a pyramid of biomass here, the dominant species in this region would be the grass because it has the most biomass. In the water, or like in the ocean here, zooplankton would be the dominant species because it has the most biomass. Now, energy pyramids always get smaller, but we can have pyramid numbers and pyramids of biomass where they're almost inverted or they are in um, different proportion. They don't look like perfectly nice pyramids. But energy pyramids are also always pyramid, and there's this energetic hypothesis that only 10% of the energy is actually usable in the next up the food chain here. So these phytoplankton or these producers, they might have 10,000 available energy units, right? But only 1,000 gets transferred up to the primary consumers because so much energy is being used just to stay alive and is released as heat. So this gets us back to Aldo Leopold and thinking like a mountain and the land ethic. When we start talking about how removal of one thing from an ecosystem affects everything else. So if you take out a top carnivore, you have a different scenario once it's removed. So when the top carnivore is here, this wolf, you have a mix of large and small predators. You have a diverse plant community, diverse songbird community, fewer large herbivores though. However, once it's gone, now we have small predators that are dominating, a simplified plant community because of these numerous large herbivores, which if you don't have as many diversity in the plant community, you have a lower songbird diversity. And one thing is going to affect the other. So with these different models of ecosystems, sometimes we describe a top-down model where it's the apex predator that controls everything, but that's also going to have a chain reaction on everything else. And when we talk about the land ethic, although Leopold is like the nutrients in the land really set is a huge limiting factor for everything else. Now, if you have a question like this, again, coming back to detrivores, you have a food web like this and there's no bacteria or fungi, what is going to be the result? And ultimately here, if you have all this going on, but you don't have anything that's recycling the nutrients, like again, this is an energy showing the transfer of energy. But if you don't recycle the nutrients through bacteria and fungi, the grasses, the bush, the tree, these producers are going to be less productive. And if they're less productive, then everything else is going to suffer. And again, a lot of times we always think about how bacteria is harmful, but when it comes to ecosystems, they really have an absolutely essential role. Now we're getting more into ecosystem ecology, moving a little bit away from the food webs, even though when we talk about food webs, we also talk about nutrients. We have primary production and nutrient cycles. These are two big areas to focus on within ecosystem ecology. When we talk about primary production, we are talking about primary producers, which are autotrophs, which are photosynthetic organisms. When we talk about net primary production, we're talking about whatever new biomass is added to the plants. Now, we have photosynthesis and cellular respiration take place. So again, we are building up these organic compounds, these sugars, through the chloroplast within plants. However, not all of that sugar that's made goes directly into the biomass of the plant because some of that glucose is being used by the plant for its own respiration. So gross primary production is all of the glucose produced, but net primary production is what's left over after the plant has used the glucose for its own respiration. So we were thinking about this. What factors affect new biomass? This is a lab that we focus on, but when we talk about new biomass, we're talking about net primary production. And hopefully you can talk about biotic factors, like the interactions, the competitions, the different living things that interact with one another. But we also tie into these abiotic factors, and this is how we're going to make our transition really into from primary production into the ecosystem, because we're talking about soil and nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, and water. Of course, any of these other things that affect plants or affect chemical reactions are also going to have a role. But when we talk about our nutrient cycles, our biogeochemical cycles, we want to ask these couple of questions. How does the nutrient get into living things? We also want to focus on the role of decomposition in detrivores. That's always a main concern of ours. And if a disturbance occurs where something is added or removed, how does that ultimately affect the overall cycle? How are the populations affected? And that gets us back into graphing again. Again, look at this thing. Again, so important. How does chemicals get into living things? Typically, we're thinking through plants. What is the role of detrivores to recycle the nutrients back into a usable form from dead material? And ultimately, if you change one thing in here, what effect is that going to have on everything else? If you take out tertiary consumers, these expand, these get pushed down. How does that affect then a graph or the populations of all of those things? So again, water, how does it get into living things? From plants. Now, we can drink water, obviously, but there's things like our bearded dragon, it doesn't really drink water. It gets its water from the plants that it eats. So how does it get into living things? Now, in this case, detrivores don't have a major role in the water cycle, but if you take plants away, you're going to affect the water cycle. Now, water cycle, again, is a little bit elementary, and we're going to step it up a notch. So we started talking about the carbon cycle, and the carbon cycle a lot of times is just focused on photosynthesis and cellular respiration. But the carbon cycle is incredibly important into the ocean because a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide sinks into the ocean and is stored. I know we have a huge store of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but we have photosynthesis going on in the ocean. So carbon is absolutely required to be in a dissolved form in water. But how does carbon get into living things? Through photosynthesis. And then ultimately through eating, right? And as things are getting eaten, the carbon moves on up the food chain. When we look at the nitrogen cycle, again, um, as we focus on this, we want to say, how does it get into living things? Now, nitrogen is the most popular gas in the atmosphere. 78% of the air is nitrogen. So how in the world does it get into plants? Can they just breathe it in as they do carbon dioxide? The answer is no. Nitrogen comes through the roots, through nitrates. So how does it get from the air to nitrates? It needs to get fixed into the soil from bacteria, whether it's on the legume roots or just separate bacteria. That gets turned into a form. I mean, that can go straight into the plant here, but if it's going this direction, it gets into ammonia, and decomposers breaking down plants turn that nitrogen that's stored in these plants back into ammonia. But now we need more bacteria to turn into nitrites. And then we need more bacteria to turn it from nitrites to nitrates. And now it can get sucked up into the roots and built up into amino acids and proteins and nucleic acids. Phosphorus, again, is another really important thing for living things because nucleic acids contain phosphorus. So how does it get into living things? It gets into the soil. Wearing down rocks puts phosphates in the soil, and plants bring it up through the roots, which then can be transferred to animals. Again, role of decomposers here, really essential because that also puts the phosphorus back into the soil. All of these things can get tied into disturbances as well. And in this, it says a disturbance struck Shannon Pond. Sewage leached into the pond, altered the natural flow of nutrients available to organisms. This set off a chain reaction of occurrences. If we look at this graph, can we figure out the patterns and the relationships between biotic and abiotic factors? So, what this graph is showing is time, and it's showing the quantity of producers. So, I just do cyanobacteria and the aquatic plant population. Now, again, the units are all arbitrary. It's more the trends that we're looking at. So, the producers are chugging along, and then they go way up, and then they go way down, and then they stay low. So, where in this change in the population of producers might sewage have leaked in? And I would say it's right about here. Because if you add sewage, we would add a tremendous amount of phosphorus or nitrogen, which would help the plants. And the plants would have this huge boost in production. Okay, you'd have a lot more plants because they now aren't limited by the availability of certain nutrients. Remember back when we were talking about carrying capacity and limiting factors, if you increase some things, you can increase the carrying capacity. So now it can hold more. However, these things turn over, they die. So then, as they die off here, because they overshot their carrying capacity because the nitrogen runs out and we get in trouble, now we're going to have a huge crash in the population. So that initial crash in the population, we don't have this cyclical flow around the carrying capacity because we're tying it into dissolved oxygen as well. I know this is pretty complicated, but stay with it. So the second thing is what would happen to the detrivore? So detrivores break down dead things, right? So it would be chugging along, and then as all of these plants die, you would expect a spike in the decomposers. Now, dissolved oxygen, you think plants. Plants take in carbon dioxide and they give off oxygen. So if you have this huge boost in plants, you would also expect a boost in oxygen levels. And oxygen levels increasing and more plants would be good for consumers, right? However, once these plants die off, these algae bloom dies off, and the amount of decomposers spikes, these guys suck the oxygen out of the environment a lot. So once they suck that oxygen out, the oxygen is going to go up because there's more plants, everything's good. But now, as this all dies and you increase the amount of decomposers, these guys are sucking all the oxygen out of the water. And what happens without oxygen? The plants can't rebound. If the plants don't rebound, all the fish are going to die, and if the fish are dying, you're going to continue to keep this high level of decomposers. As long as the decomposers stay high, the oxygen is going to stay low. So this looks super crazy when it comes to imagining all of these different populations being affected by not only each other, but by abiotic factors like phosphorus and dissolved oxygen as well. So ultimately with this, it's important that you can interpret nutrient cycles, predict the effects of a change in one component of the nutrient cycle on the rest of the ecosystem. You need to be able to interpret food webs and pyramids and predict again how changing one part of the community may ultimately affect the trophic structure or the whole web and how things interact with one another on an eating and energy basis. And then again, ecology has a lot to do with graphs and patterns. So this is tying us back to biotic and abiotic factors because an ecosystem not only takes into consideration the living things in an area, but all of the um, unliving, non-living things as well. So hopefully that is helpful.